Welcome everyone. My name is Jante Mosselman. I'm program editor at the Bali, and tonight I will speak with Géraldine Schwarz and Abram de Swaan. It is 75 years since the Second World War ended, and therefore we created a series. It's called People of Europe, and we asked prominent historians and thinkers from all different European backgrounds to reflect on Europe and on Europe, its people. Thank you both for being here. Géraldine Schwarz, you're a journalist and writer. You wrote the book Les Amnesiques. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
De geheugenlozen in Dutch, those without memory. You could maybe say in English?
Yeah, who lost memory at some point in their life.
Thank you. And we were speaking with emeritus professor Abram de Swaan, a great sociologist, has written many books and essays. Recently, Tegen de vrouwen, Against the Women, which is a bit of a provocative title for a very emancipatoire book. And of course, you probably also have read The Killing Compartments. Welcome, both. What we're going to do is, Géraldine Schwarz wrote an essay for this evening, and she's going to read some bits and pieces of it. Then we'll talk, and afterwards we'll also come towards you, the audience, and you're very happy to join in. So shall we start with the first?
Thank you,
fragment?
Jante. Hello, everybody. Hello, Amsterdam. I'm very happy that some courageous people came tonight, despite the really nice weather. So I feel honored. So this is an essay I wrote for your project, which is called WWII Europe. And I decided to link it to a very topical subject, which is the debate about how to face the colonial past. So I will read some extracts of it, and I will start with the beginning. Up until the Second World War, remembering history served only to glorify the nation, to stir up revanchism, to sanctify heroes. After 1945, the trauma of the war gave rise to a new endeavor in Europe, that of learning from history. For the past to help us make our present better, it is not enough to name a few culprits from history and to tear down their statues. Certainly, anger is understandable when authorities allow very controversial figures to go on being honored in public spaces without any contextualization. But iconoclasm often only serves an illusion of justice. Soon after, the forgetting starts, and a missed opportunity to utilize our past to get to know ourselves better is all that remains. The removal of statues and street names also buries the responsibility of millions of citizens on whose complicity a criminal system was founded, built, and able to persist. These colonial leaders were able to do what they did because entire societies in Europe, in the Americas, as well as in the Arab world and the Ottoman Empire, thought like them. They may not have had actual blood on their hands, but many benefited from the cruel and savage domination of one man over the other. The complicity of the mass of the people in such a criminal system seems a much more central question to me than the guilt of an individual slave trader or a sadistic colonist. And such societal responsibility seems less relevant in the obscurantist era of Christopher Columbus than in time of enlightenment. In France, the United States, Great Britain, and of course, the Netherlands. The argument that history cannot be judged with the parameters of the present is more difficult to defend when you look at this period. For even if these countries were not democracies as we understand them today, they boasted of how they advocated freedom and tolerance at home, but then went off to betray those principles elsewhere. The Dutch were the first to experience enlightenment. The Republic was truly ahead of its time, advocating self-governments, community spirit, and an enlightened civil society. But far from Europe, she waged colonial wars, of great violence and practiced slavery. Later on, the United States, Great Britain, and France would in their turn be guilty of double standards. Despite the Enlightenment, they continued to oppress and exploit people on large scale. The oppression continued after the Second World War, after they had proclaimed their moral superiority over fascism. To what extent has this double standard discredited and continues to discredit the ideas of the Enlightenment in the world today? Millions of French, British, Dutch, and American citizens took part in this hypocrisy. This reflection is central because it gives us the opportunity to take the perspective of the perpetrator, which is essential to learn from the past. It allows us to become aware of our own fallibility. It sends each of us back to our present-day responsibilities, our contradictions. It helps us realize that one doesn't have to serve an unfair system directly to be complicit with it. Following the crowd through indifference, opportunism, or conformism is also a form of complicity.
Thank you. I want to start with something you say in the end of the essay, and you say the perspective of the perpetrator is essential to learn from the past. Why is it so important?
I think what we've learned in Europe, especially after the Second World War, was to take the perspective of the victim. That actually took quite a long time to do so. But after, it depends on the countries, but after several years, 20, 30 years according to the country, started to grow a kind of empathy which was not existent before the Second World War. And this is something which many European countries shared, I think, this learning empathy. This is also something that you can forget. The learning is not, it has to be nourished, of course, you know, continuously nourished. But I think this is something we share in Europe, to have had this work on the empathy with the victim. But what has maybe not been done in this work of memory, of remembering history, is to take the perspective of the perpetrator. And this is one of the key of the success of the work of memory in Germany, is that the Germans, for obvious reasons, had to take the perspective of the perpetrator, which allowed them to have another view on themselves and to realize their malleability and their fallibility and to question themselves much more, which I think has had an impact on the sense for democratic responsibility in Germany. And most countries haven't done this, especially the countries which also were perpetrators, like Italy, hasn't done this work, or Spain, which also had a dictatorship of a great violence. And the result, one of the results today of that is growing extremist parties, because their democracy are not solid enough.
And do you have an example of an impact that you see because Germany did confront its past in a different way?
I think the best example is actually Germany itself, because it was shared in two parts, East Germany and West Germany. And you can see a different political culture in both parts. And this is, second to me, also due to the fact that in Western Germany this work has been done. It started late, after 20 years of amnesia, but it did start. And whereas in the East, which was a communist dictatorship, this work hasn't been done. And today we have an extreme right party in Germany, which has 2 to 3 times more better results in the East than in the West.
Abram, do you agree with the perspective of the perpetrator, and that we have to know that?
I'm not sure I exactly understand what it means. one could, of course, pay attention to the fact that there were perpetrators and what they actually afflicted on populations. But the perspective of the perpetrator may also mean how perpetrators now look back to their past. And there one can be rather decisive. Perpetrators do not look back at their past. It's very exceptional. The perspective of the perpetrator on his own past is absent. And it is almost a miracle of human ability to cover up, to repress, to forget. But it is extremely rare that retaking the German perpetrators as an example, are not completely caught up in denial and forgetfulness. So it is the perspective of the perpetrator is almost absent, and that is mysterious.
I think also there is maybe a misunderstanding with the word perspective, also
Yes.
with identifying with.
Yes.
I use this in French very much.
Yeah.
S'identifier avec,
Ouais.
which doesn't mean that you defend the perpetrator or that you are the perpetrator. In my own family story, which I write about in my book, my grandparents, which were not big perpetrators, but they were Mitläufer, which means they were
Yes.
following the current. And so,
Meelopers, yes.
yeah, Mitlopers. And so they never, of course, had this view, this perspective of the perpetrator because they didn't see themselves as a perpetrator. So you're totally right that I think this kind of work is not done for the perpetrator because there is nothing. Most of the time, there is nothing to expect from a perpetrator to realize that what he did and to apologize. But it's for the next generations, and it's in Germany, the next generation, of course, being German, took this perspective of the perpetrator, they identified
Meaning
with the perpetrator.
they got very interested in them. They talked about
they
them.
imagined that it could be themselves.
Oh yeah.
That's what I mean. It's the
yeah.
work of putting yourself in the Haut, in the skin of.
Yes, that's
so
also
imagine
a dangerous adventure.
That's a dangerous adventure, but if you never do this exercise of putting yourself in the skin of the potential perpetrator, with perpetrator I don't mean a monster, yes? I mean somebody who takes part to a criminal
Who committed
system.
monstrous deeds.
Yeah, or which takes part in a criminal system or helps it to be consolidated.
Yeah,
That's
I know
what
that young students, for example, are intrigued. Would I have done, if I would have stood in his boots, the same thing?
Yes.
And there is a very general idea, which is almost unthinkably always applied, that perpetrators are ordinary people, just like you and me, count me out, and ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances commit extraordinary crimes. And there is a need to somehow say we all are in the same boat. In fact, I don't think that's true. But that's for another. Yes, of course. Would I have done the same thing? Would I have been courageous, or would I have been, cowardly?
The German historian Norbert Frey, maybe you know him, he's written a lot about this work of memory, and he said, the fact that we don't know what we would have done doesn't mean that we don't know what we should have done. And
Absolutely.
I think this is the work of taking the perspective of the perpetrator, to imagine being in this position, and not only with the victim, having this empathy for the victim.
Right.
You talk about also in our dealing with memory about removing statues of colonial rulers, and you write that that after removing them, people will soon forget. And I was wondering, will they, because there's also other ways to memorize things, why do you think it's important that we contextualize them and not remove them?
Because it's the only way to learn something. If you have a statue of let's say in Rome, there is still in the city an obelisk of fascist times in front of the Foro Romano, a district which was built by Mussolini, and it's written very large font on it. It's written Mussolini Dux, Mussolini der Führer, the leader, yes, without any contextualization. So this is actually paying a tribute to Mussolini. If you contextualize and you explain actually the crimes of Mussolini, because this obelisk attracts the attention, it's a great opportunity to remind people who pass by of these crimes. So it's the question is, of course, how do you contextualize? It's easy with Mussolini. Probably it's much more difficult with one of the Dutch heroes of colonial times. You should probably contextualize so much that you need a book for that. But what do you think, Abram?
Well, I very much agree with you. I'm against taking away monuments and throwing in the water, the plons van brons. I think that I would like these monuments to remain in a very uncomfortable, very unpleasant way. So, for example, with Mussolini ducks, I propose just a minor correction. Mussolini sucks. And that would be, in a way, enough. And what is this? What about Mussolini? Then people start talking. My proposal is let all those Southern Confederate criminals stand, just cut off their heads. And I would be totally pleased and satisfied. But I want to see Lee. I want to remain him there without a head. And a man without a head, that is the most profound humiliation I can think of, because we must transform statues of honor into statues of shame. Therefore, Mussolini sucks. That is, I want to deface. I want to deface monuments.
It could give ideas to people to do it for real.
No, I'm perfectly serious. I have my soul ready. I'm ready to suck off.
But why? And why do? But why do we need a confrontation with history in our public space? Why is it not so? Why is it not enough to, educate people in schools? Or why is the public space so important?
I think it's just complementary. It's one more way to have... actually, also, it's a kind of way to accept that past is part of our present, because the division of past and present is artificial. So it's just accept that it's part of our everyday life, because we come from there. It's also a way to remind how you come from. Because if we forget where we come from, I think we are very easily to manipulate, because our values also come from somewhere. I wasn't born with the values I have today. It is a legacy. So it reminds me of this legacy and why I have these values. Berlin is, of course, a very good example, because you have traces of the past everywhere and of the negative past. There had been a very big debate in Berlin for the construction of the Holocaust Memorial, which is really in the center of the city, so visible. It's close to the Brandenburger Gate, so you have this very touristic attraction, and on the side, exactly at the same situation, you have the Holocaust monument, which is as big as a football place. So. It's also there to. I think it's just there to remind us why we are who we are, and maybe also why we are in Europe together, because it's also your theme where it comes from. Because if the new generations or young generations forget where they come from, why should they defend the European values?
Allow me. What is very interesting about this Berlin monument, not only the place it is in the very heart of Berlin, where East and West come together, near the parliament. It's an awfully sensitive point where it is. It is huge, and it took 13 years of the most vehement, obstreperous debates. People were really at each other's throat, historians, everyone. now you think, what? That's very bad. People have been fighting with each other for 13 years. No, the whole point of that monument is that for 13 years it was being talked about. The great mistake about our Namen monument, which will be the great monument for the Holocaust in Amsterdam, is that all debate was stifled. But debate is the point. Monuments are only alive, or will only be born, will come to be created, out of our discussion. And discussions can sometimes be vehement. So even at its it is not yet created, it's not yet established, the Holocaust monument, the Namen monument, but already it's dead, because every kind of discussion was avoided.
And why?
Because people felt that it was too sacred to be discussed.
Still, today.
It's a difficult question, why they were so afraid. I've personally opposed it. And many people, for very good reasons, were in favor of it, and I respect them all, which is already a certain way of doing a debate. Fear of discussion, fear of opposition. Their idea was that a monument is of all of us, and we should all come together, and we should all agree that the Holocaust was awful, which in fact it was. But there's more to say about it. For example, a very, very painful point in how far were Dutch people in their passivity or in their active collaboration complicit to a extermination of Dutch Jews in the highest percentage of all of Europe. What happened there? Some people might get very angry. And who belongs there? A very good question. Who should be on the monument? Huh?
And also maybe should the Holocaust be the main European memory we have in common? This is also, of course, a question which is important because it is a very negative memory, and maybe we need also something more positive to
memory
balance.
Means that you disagree and that you talk about it, and you might not even end up agreeing. You might disagree, right? I'm asking you.
Memory is it? Maybe it's also another. It has another meaning in English. I don't know. Mémoire.
Yeah.
It's what I mean. It's a negative
Living memory.
It's a negative memory, the Holocaust, and Europe's main memory. Europe's memory work is based on remembering the Holocaust, which is something very negative, as remembering only something negative, and maybe we need something positive also to balance that in order to empower also new generations to defend this Europe.
The work we have to do today is remembering slavery and working on the memory and the actuality of race discrimination. So there we have another negative chapter.
Yes.
And the idea is, people think memory is that you sing the national anthem together, but that's not it. It is quarreling about what song has to be sung.
You wrote an article about this a few years ago called Post-Colonial Absences, and you said we don't want to know what we know.
Yes.
And why do we not want to know this?
Ask Géraldine. She wrote an entire book about it.
Well, I mean, you wrote the essay.
Yes.
But why is it so? Why is it so? We know these things. There are these documents. There are more and more books being written. So why is it still so complicated to confront it?
You mean the colonial past?
Yes.
Well, I think it's because in a way it sends us back to our own responsibilities and our own contradictions today. For example, I don't think there is any colored person in this room today. This is one we're talking about the subject, there is no color. So this is a debate which is difficult because actually everybody feels a bit coward in this debate. And this is my perception of this will to forget. But also it is because many people in many countries don't understand that in order to transform a difficult past into a richness, into wealth, you know, the burden of the past into wealth, you have to confront the burden, the shadows of history. And this is something, for example, in Spain, you hear most of the time politicians defending amnesia because they think actually to go back to the past and to all the suffering is a burden for the present and the future. And they don't understand how to change this into something positive to shape our present and our future.
Yeah, I want to come back to a theme which we raised before about these perpetrators basically having no perspective, having no memory. This isn't there, even though everybody sort of knows it is there. And it is very difficult to describe what occurs when people repress memory, because you know something and you do not know it. Macht sich nicht wissen. You make yourself not know, which is a strange activity. If I said, for example, red, I don't want you to think of red. You would have to. So, and the same can apply to collectives like the Dutch nation, having an enormous problem in remembering what happened in Indonesia. There are waves of remembrance and then they ebb away again, but we have not come to terms with what happened there. And we also haven't listened to other voices who have talked about what Indonesians did to one another. The idea is that first we should go through our own guilt and then we should contextualize and say what Indonesians did to Indonesians during that war. I'm not so sure. But how does a society not know what it knows? How do you do that? What psychoanalysts very easily know, they have a word, repression, but it doesn't explain anything.
I think it's a question for psychoanalysts. In Germany, there was this book published in the 60s, Mitschalicht, two psychoanalysts, which is called die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, the incapacity to mourn, yes. And there, one of their, of course, it's a very complex book, but one of their theses is that actually the Germans were, of course, traumatized, but not because of the crimes committed under the Third Reich and the fact that they had actually supported such a criminal regime, but because they had lost the war, and they had lost also the Nazi dream, you know. And I think this is also something that sometimes we tend to underestimate, that fascism and National Socialism was also a dream, and also imperialism and colonialism, which is something which made people also dream, which also is one of the reasons why it is after so difficult to recognize that actually your dream was a nightmare. I think that would be a psychoanalyst approach. Yeah,
my psychoanalysts have a word for it, repression, but nobody knows how it works. It is because it is inherently paradoxical.
But what I find really fascinating is collective repression.
Yes.
This is in Germany in the 50s, my grandparents, of course, totally repressed this past, but all Germans, even the Social Democrats, actually were for amnesia and amnesty, which is amnesty. How do you say amnesty. So it was actually the whole society which wanted just to erase the past.
Forget it. Yeah.
And I find it interesting that this came in a quite spontaneous way, without people talking about it together, without having a kind of project that, yes, we are going to forget that this happens in a spontaneous way. This is something maybe a sociologist can explain.
It is a great mystery. It's very difficult to understand because it's about sort of a sleepishness of the mind. Your attention drifts away, or somebody just mentions it. For example, somebody mentions, well, you remember my uncle died on this day in 1944, and then the other person says, let's have coffee, which is absurd, but this is a little bit how it works. Yeah.
It's always also a very simple way of protecting yourself.
Yeah.
This is
From your own
devils of history. I think this is quite. But it is of course, I think, counterproductive. What do you think, Abram? I mean, we mentioned that book so. From David Reef,
yes.
who actually advocates the forgetting.
But he's also being a little facetious.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But this is about, he was a correspondent during the Balkan Wars, David Reef, and he was so impressed by these eternal digging up of mythified and mystified chapters from a very far past in order to justify attacking and killing contemporary people. I think basically that is his...
yes, that of course remembering should not be instrumentalized. To spread hatred and wars and sectarianism, but of course, to decide to forget can, in the first time, maybe allow a kind of reconciliation, but it doesn't last. I don't think it's last. A reconciliation which is based on forgetting doesn't last. And one good example that of the contrary is the reconciliation between France and Germany, my two countries, which was actually based really on remembering the past together, and there again, changing perspective. It's always important taking the perspective of the victim and of the perpetrator, but then also taking the perspective of the neighbor country, of the other community. I mean, this is actually what it's all about. Learning from the past is trying to take the perspective of the other. This is the best way to learn from the past. And as we know, most of the people, even in another context, are not able to take the perspective of the other.
No, and I think what you just said also is happening now. Maybe that's the way we deal with the past and how we use it also to glorify ourselves, and that it's sort of driven apart to two parties. The one party who wants to admit that the Dutch colonial history was wrong, and the other ones who say, no, I don't want to give up these people who were so important in the forming of this country.
For some countries, I understand that need of thinking of a glorious past, for example, Russia, because Russia has been very humiliated after the fall of the wall, the disparition of the USSR, and I think I understand totally that the Russians need this mystification of history. Of course, I don't agree at all, and it's pretty dangerous. But I don't understand when countries like the Netherlands, they don't need that actually, because they have a present to be proud of. So they don't really need, I think, this mystification of history, despite the fact that they're a small country. But otherwise, it's working quite well in the Netherlands.
Yeah, but we're in the middle of something, which is, of course, Black Lives Matter. And suddenly, to everybody's surprise, it's in Holland, it's in France, it is in Finland, it's all over the world. Now, of course, the one image of a white man with one hand in his pocket and his knee on the neck of a suffocating black man for 9 minutes, that is incredible. And it makes a huge impression, and suddenly there is this wave, and these people are pointing the finger at me, the most innocent person of them all, telling me that I have white privilege and forcing me to be in an uneasy situation. Okay, I acknowledge I have white privilege. But what do you want me to do about it? So you suddenly find yourself in an uneasy position where your innocence, my great white innocence, is questioned, and you are going to look for arguments to say, look, it was not me, this was 300 years ago, I wasn't even born, I'm not responsible. But, you see, since about 50 years, there are hundreds of thousands of people of color in the Netherlands, right here in this city. And they just, as you mentioned, it doesn't happen coincidentally not to be here. It's a very uneasy situation to be in. But it's a very interesting situation. We're going to learn one or two things, and I'm looking forward to it. So this is, we're in the midst of it, and so are you. Whether you flee to Paris or you run to Berlin, you can't run away from it. So here we are in one of these memories. And I have nothing to do with slavery. I'm against slavery, by the way, strongly.
But still, as you said, this system of discrimination still exists and persisted, even after the end of racial segregation. And probably the reason why it's resisted and still exists is because each of us has played a part in a way which is very tiny, so it is difficult to understand which part we are actually playing in this. But
you say we have played it. What part have you played? What wrong have you done to a person of color?
Maybe indifference.
Okay, indifference. You stand accused of indifference. What else? It's a funny position to be in. We have to question ourselves.
It is, yes, it is. Maybe working for companies. If you work for a company, this is what I mean with be aware of the consequences. It is very difficult to understand the consequences of your behavior, of your how you consume, also consumers' habit. I mean, I probably did contribute to discrimination with my consumers' habit, that's for sure. But it is very easy not to see the real end of your consequence, the consequence of your act. It is Günter Grass, the German author Günter Grass, he always was obsessed by this idea that it is very easy to forget the consequence of your behavior if you don't see it, if it's far from home. I mean, the extermination camps were also built far from Germany, so that nobody could actually see what happens. Doesn't mean that they didn't know or felt, but you can forget more easily if you don't see what happens. So this is, I think, my part maybe in this system.
I want to go to the second part that you were going to read.
Facing up to the shadows of history shouldn't be done in a culture of guilt, nor serving a cult of victim. Nor should it be instrumentalized to stir up hatred or sectarianism, or to nourish an anachronistic and Manichaean vision of the past. However, no reconciliation is lasting, no peace is solid, no past is appeased without an essential step, being able to apologize. Yet many shy away from this process. Great Britain, Spain, Italy, and also, of course, the Netherlands. The Netherlands is struggling to come to terms with its colonial past, which is largely unknown among the population. And in general, apologies are not their strength. They were one of the last countries in Europe to apologize in January 2020 for the failure of the authorities to protect the Jewish community during the Nazi occupation. 75% perished, by far one of the highest rates in Europe. Recently, I think it was, what's the name of Alexander? With Willem Alexander.
Oh, the king, yes.
The king, yes. Yes, there was these apologies
Yes,
in
they're very
Indonesia.
interesting, yes.
Totally unexpected.
Yeah.
And so in 1 year, we have 2 apologies. And this recent increase of apologies in the Netherlands reveal a better understanding of how to transform the weight of the past into wealth, confront the shadows of history instead of ignore them. A repressed history has a boomerang effect. It returns in form of communal tensions, divided society, populism, racism, antisemitism. It damages international relations and discredits the European model of an open and democratic society. If Europe wants to have a normative influence in the world, if it wants to assert its values in the face of authoritarian models, the former colonial powers must finally face up to their historical responsibilities.
Thank you. I want to talk about that boomerang because I think that is one of the most vital points that we should talk about now. So if you don't confront your past as a nation and you have this repressed history, you say it's going to turn on you. And I want to go into depth because how does that work?
I think it is very simple. It works as it works for an individual. Of course, if you repress something you've experienced, it will come back most of the time. So I think it's a very logic phenomenon, which is widespread among individuals, and it's also widespread among societies. And if you don't confront this past, then there will be a vacuum. And in this vacuum, you can invent a new past. And so trying to forget the past or repressing it means leaving others the space to invent a new past or to mystify it. And most of the time, these are extremist ideologies, extremist parties, which try to take profit of this amnesia to invent a new past. Because if you, and this Putin has understood that very well, if you control the past, you control the present. Because you can tell the people where they come from. You can tell them what their identity is.
You can tell them they have more rights to a certain piece of land than somebody else.
For example, or they have, of course, in the case of Trump, for example, it would be to only recognize one identity, which would be white, Christian, preferably male. And this is actually the exact contrary of what Europe has tried to work on since 1945, which is we are all free to choose our identity. Of course, this is very ideal, but it's the aim, it's the intention. It's that we can choose our identity and it is not limited. And it makes it, of course, more difficult. It's more difficult to choose your identity than to take an identity that somebody serves you on a silver plate. But this is what I mean with it has this boomerang effect.
I see you crossing your arms.
So?
Why?
Well, you had to do something with it.
That's true.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yes, on the whole, I agree. People tend to invent all sorts of histories and memories, and that can be quite dangerous, I agree. Whether one learns very much from the past, the unadorned real past, I'm not sure. People have come before me and said history doesn't teach, holds no lessons. And I was reminded that maybe you can sometimes learn from the future. Like this whole coronavirus, we could have been learning a little bit quicker from the future that was held before us by epidemiologists and virologists. Even I wrote an article 20 years ago about the coming pandemia. It was not so difficult because so this was a dystopia which we were constantly reminded, and we refused to learn about the future. And you can sort of project that to climates. There hasn't been climate change on this scale in these proportions as we are now expecting. So we must learn from our expectations. What do you think about that as a historian?
I'm not a historian, and I think historians are very, very bad to predict the future. They were always bad. What you mean with expectation implies that you predict, and this is something I'm very cautious about, because there could be something else before climate change. Who predicted the pandemic? So,
this pandemic was for 20 years predicted by everybody in epidemiology who could write his own name, even by me who had been working on urban hygienics. Everybody knew that a pandemic was coming, that it was going to be precisely as this one is, except when.
Yes.
And there were a few false starts, SARS and MERS, but we could and should have been much better prepared than we were. There's another example, nuclear war, which there has been one nuclear explosion, just one in 1945, August 2. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And again, that's an expectation. We could learn more from the expectation of nuclear war. We have a pretty realistic idea. And we should maybe teach Trump, not from the past, but from the future, that he should not undermine the nuclear treaties with Russia.
I think the future helps us to be creative. Which maybe the past doesn't really help us to be creative. This is what the richness I see in the future, because you have to learn to project
These are
yourself.
Grounded expectations.
Yes, yes. So this is very good for creativity, and which the past probably doesn't nourish. But you cannot, maybe you don't learn from history as not to repeat it, but you learn from history as much you learn from your own life. And I don't know what you think, because you're a bit more advanced in life, but
Absolutely.
Would you say you haven't learned anything?
That's a good question. Have I learned? I learned a lot, but they were all the wrong things.
But this is, it's like, it's an experience. History is the experience you have in life. And either you take it or you don't take it. My advice would be, take it.
Now, I, and to a degree you too, we have learned a lesson from history, and it may not be the right one, but I personally are very much, I don't want to say obsessed, but involved with the Shoah, and so reading your book are you. So we have this one lesson, but we may not react correctly each time. But I very strongly look at contemporary events from that perspective, and it may sometimes be the wrong perspective. But there is a lesson that we are constantly applying. We're thinking about Trump very much in terms of Adolf Hitler. And you can understand a lot about Trump if you have Hitler in mind, but he is not Adolf Hitler. He might be more, maybe Mussolini or...
Yes, what I said in the first part of the essay is that I think the biggest opportunity history gives us is to learn from ourselves. It's to learn to know ourselves better. And this is not something which comes from me, but this is something which comes from Richard von Weizsäcker, which was a president, German president, and who in '85 hold a famous speech in front of the Bundestag, the German parliament, and said, history teaches us what men are capable of, and we should not think that we are better. And I think this is actually a very good guideline to keep in mind. You don't need to know if Trump looks like is like Hitler or Mussolini, but just first look at yourself and be vigilant. Yes. And this is, for me, the most important message this is what I mean with learning from history. But to do this, you have to be able to imagine that you could be a perpetrator. If you never imagine that you could be the perpetrator but only the victim, then you never learn this lesson. This is, I think, what Richard von Weizsäcker wanted to tell us.
Yeah, but there may be a difference between von Weizsäcker and me. There are more differences, by the way. But frankly, I don't think, under any circumstances, I would be shooting naked little babies, grown men, naked in the snow, in a row, 1 hour, 2 hours. I would not do that. Maybe I would not do that because I know it's been done, but frankly, I am not like that, nor are most people. And maybe you should train not to be like that. And I have a very great misgivings about these ideas. We are all ordinary people capable under extraordinary circumstances of committing the most atrocious crimes. I think this is basically a non-believer's transposition of Christian ideas about we're all sinners, and if we are led into temptation, we will commit the worst sins. And I think all of that is bullshit. Although I should add as a sociologist, yes, you can be led into temptation, but we are not all the same.
But this is, with Perpetrator, I don't mean that you are the monster. You are not necessarily the monster, but you are the Mitläufer, which is somebody who will indirectly, by indifference, by its opportunism, by its conformism, help a monstrous regime to be consolidated. Because this is what
is an
happened in Germany.
accomplice, and often an unwitting accomplice, but it is not the same as somebody who commits these mass murders. Your grandfather was a very complicated man, by the way, very interesting, and also you call him a Mitläufer. And since I'm your reader, I may repeat that. But he was not a killer or a perpetrator or a torturer.
But this is, the Mitläufer is the central figure in the work of memory in Germany. Because if you only focus on the monsters, exactly as you said, you never...
monster is not my word, by the way, yeah.
Oh, how would you name them?
Mass murder.
Okay, mass murder. Then nobody can imagine being a mass murderer as you described it. So but many can imagine being somebody like my grandfather.
Yes.
Having a little moment of...
No,
opportunism.
He was a real kind of person, like you meet a lot of times, and you wish you would not have made his mistakes if you were in his shoes.
And in that moment, if there are millions of that kind, they support a criminal system. This is what I mean with...
So the lesson is maybe not on so much on an individual level, but more the realization that if we don't look out, we could together, all of us, end up in a system that commits horrible deeds. That is the lesson.
Yes.
Another thing you mentioned...
This mechanism, they repeat themselves. How? I mean, it's probably as a sociologist, you know about this experiment. I don't remember the name of this experiment of student we were...
Milgram.
Yes. You know, so these are mechanisms which is part of our of the human condition.
But I want to ask also, because we're now talking a lot about also nations confronting their past and their Second World War past and their colonial past. But in what way? Why is it? How should Europe remember? How do these different memories should be?
It's a very, very big challenge. I don't think. I think, as I mentioned before, Europe tried to find a common ground by commemorating the Holocaust. It worked okay in the West, but then when the wall fell, there was this intention actually from the EU to politely invite Eastern European countries to do the same, to commemorate the Holocaust. But it doesn't work like this when it comes from up. And so a country like Hungary has, they have their Holocaust museum. They also apologized before the Dutch. In 2015, I think Orban apologized. And there are monuments, but antisemitism is very strong in Hungary, so it didn't work the way the EU actually hoped it would work. So the way to impose a common ground of memory, I think, is a failure. 75 years after, we can say that this is actually a failure. I mean, the figures about antisemitism coming back in Europe, I mean, probably never disappeared, but are high enough to show that this actually didn't work as a common ground. I think this is, I don't have any precise idea about it, but I think maybe it is time also to try to find a positive common ground, not only the memory of our guilt, but also the memory of the fact that Europe has triumphed over fascism in the West and communist dictatorship in the East. But the most important thing is always to take the perspective of the other. So I don't know in what form you could do that, but trying to understand how do the others see me. This is important for the colonial past, to understand the Netherlands, how do actually the other countries see how I'm facing my colonial past, how do they do themselves, and to exchange point of views. Maybe something like a European history book, where in every country we would have a history of the country wrote by historians of your country, and parallelly, historians of another country.
Things like that have been done, and it's very fruitful, yes. For example, there is now in Holland a huge project in which Dutch historians and Indonesian historians try to write a history of the Dutch presence in Indonesia.
Yes.
Very interesting. I hope it comes off well.
Yes.
People have their misgivings, but they're trying, they're talking.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just to try to have a transnational approach.
Yes.
And also a transgenerational approach, maybe, with different witnesses, because I think also maybe the story which has been written for us should maybe be written differently for younger generations. So thinking also transgenerationally.
There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yes. Yes.
I want to speak a bit more about Europe, but then I want to ask you to read the third part.
Yes. If the colonial past has been repressed to such a degree, it is maybe because another past has outweighed in it, that of the Second World War. Europe was founded on the promise of never again and has mobilized incredible energy to spread those words. It is 70 years later. What have we Europeans learned? A recent dramatic event gave us the opportunity to measure our skills. The coronavirus pandemic. On the one hand, it revealed flaws in our ability to learn from history. The ease with which so-called free societies gave up basic freedoms, for instance, freedom of movement or meeting together, has shown, once again, the effectiveness of the fear factor. Not that confinement was not justified, but how many of us found ourselves accepting everything without public debate, without discussion, including disproportionate measures. This blind preference for security at the expense of freedom is a dangerous reaction. It opens the door to a worrying evolution, our willingness to accept the use of mass surveillance tools in the name of better pandemic control. History teaches us that an alliance between technology and surveillance leads to the worst when it falls into the hands of barbarians. On the other hand, the pandemic has shown that we have understood an essential message of the 20th century's disasters. When man ceases to be human, he destroys himself. At a time when the technological and economic vision reduces men to algorithms, consumers, substitutable models, the majority of us have reaffirmed that every man is unique and that he has a fundamental right to live. In the face of utilitarian doctrines that accept the sacrifice of a minority in the name of the so-called general well-being, triumphed the refusal to give man the right to decide upon life or death, the right to compare the value of one life with another, old versus young, healthy versus sick, but also countryman versus stranger, French versus Italian, and so on. Even if late, European solidarity has shown up. These lessons from history are not a moral accessory to look good. Solidarity between generations and between European countries does not just serve humanistic ideals. It serves humanity itself. Therefore, all of us. Because tomorrow, in the face of the many challenges that lie ahead, the survival of each of us will depend on the capacity of others to be human.
Thank you. That's the end of your essay. And you say that there's three things really about the pandemic that we learned. The first one is we give up freedoms easily. The second one, but we do value all human life. And we have seen European solidarity. Have you seen these things as well?
Sorry?
Have you seen these things as well?
Yeah, but I, on the face of it, think I disagree with Géraldine in that the basic liberties or freedoms were easily abandoned in a dangerous way. Of course, things are different in different countries, but my idea was that people very well knew what they were giving up and what for they were giving it up. Of course, there were many uncertainties, and it wasn't quite clear whether this would help and how great the risk was and what the economic damage would be, all kinds of uncertainties. But people stayed home in order to avert a major rampant contagion and death. And gradually it became clear that especially people with elderly people or with an underlying condition were by far most at risk. So it became clear that if you were young and healthy, you were doing it for someone else. But many people, I think, willingly and knowingly gave up these liberties, in a way doing what Hegel used to say, when you want to do what you must do, you are truly free. It's a very dangerous statement, but it sort of applies here. People wanted to do what they must do, and then again, I completely agree. Now is the time to have a committee or a council or whatever, Conseil d'État or whatever, very, very carefully look at these several rights and liberties and see whether still they are justified by the present condition, which, by the way, changes all the time. But we must be very careful and must make sure to reclaim it. But we do it all the time. For example, you and I don't buy weapons to go shooting in the air. It is a freedom, it's even a constitutional liberty in the United States, but we feel that everybody would be better off if we didn't. Especially, you and I could do it, but then other people will do it too, so you and I won't do it. There are many, many, many liberties we sort of refrain from exercising, sometimes because of the law. So these liberties are abandoned in favor of some common good. And the absence of weapons obviously is a common good.
But
That's
you
very
think
clear.
it went too far a few times?
I do agree that, of course, it depends on the countries. I know that in the Netherlands it was a bit different, so I can't really judge the
Slightly
situation in
different.
the Netherlands.
It was not very different.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was probably very different from France. Maybe not from Germany.
It was between France and Germany.
It was between, yeah. But I think it sounds very ideal to think that most of the people took the freedom to do what they must do. For me, it sounds like an ideologic community, utopian community. I think also that many people are happy to be told what they have to do and not to think too much at the moment. I don't think that the democracy in most European countries show that most people, when they make a decision, they know what they do. I don't have this feeling. And what frightened me is that, most of the decisions which were taken, these measures, were actually issued by politicians who don't have a clue at all and who totally rely on some doctors. And you don't really know.
Well, these doctors are not exactly doctors.
Yeah,
I mean,
scientific
but we have
committees.
epidemiology and virology.
Yes.
And there is a very strong unanimity across nations and across fields about what is the best thing to do given enormous uncertainties. And as far as I can see, except for fascist countries such as the United States, or proto-fascist countries, Bolsonaro, Trump, Duterte, politicians took the lead of virologists and epidemiologists whose knowledge is full of uncertainties, but it's the best knowledge we have.
Yes, but it's not a knowledge, it's an uncertainty. And this is something...
No. That is, given major uncertainties, it is the best knowledge we have. For example, to say, we don't quite know the nature of these epidemics, but probably the best thing to do is to prevent as much human contact as is feasible, makes sense. It's about the best thing you can do.
Yes, I don't put in question the confinement measures. I said somewhere probably exaggerated in France, where you could not go further than 1 kilometer from home, even if you live on the countryside or on top of a mountain where nobody else lives, or in the middle of a forest. So I think this kind of measures don't empower people. They make them. It's like treating people like children. It's not something that encourages people to take responsibility and to think by themselves what is actually dangerous for the other. I have a margin to decide. To think and to decide, no, I think this is, I'm too responsible to do this, but going for a walk in a forest where there is nobody, I can do it, because I'm an adult. And the way...
Then there was a difference with the Netherlands,
yes,
in which the key word was, it is your own responsibility.
Yes, this was the key word also in Germany, and I think also maybe during this pandemic, there was a difference between the northern European countries and the southern European countries. In the East wasn't that affected, so I don't mention them. But where in the East, which they were much more affected, so the measures were stricter. But there was, I had the feeling, what I'm describing is more addressing these countries, where very crazy measures in Spain, I think even the children couldn't go out of the apartment. Yeah. And I was frightened to see that people accept that from one day to the other. I think this is shocking enough to be part of a debate, to discuss it at least after. But yes. I don't even think that there is any discussion on that now today about how could that happen, that the whole society obeys so easily.
Well, there's certainly right-wing people are bringing up these, why should we damage the economy to that degree? Why should young people be restricted in favor of old and sickly people? Here the right wing is taking a libertarian view, and at the very least, these arguments are worth responding to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm thinking a bit because I was also quite shocked about certain countries, and I was wondering, is the difference in the reaction? I'm wondering whether you have any idea. I know it's quite a broad question on what that's going to do for Europe in the future. Did you see that the countries are too different to be together? Did you see that in the reaction? Do you think?
Of course, they are different, but I think, as I put it at the end of my essay, we all depend from each other. Mm-hmm. So yes. This is actually the most important message during this pandemic. So it's not about are the Dutch more responsible than the Italians. It's we all need each other. Yes. So in many different ways.
In the pandemic, there was also a friction between countries. For instance, between the Netherlands and France. Because some countries felt like, and also that's still a bit going on with the Swedish. Yeah. They, many people are very.
But the differences are minute compared to the United States, where you have people who refuse any kind of isolation measure in the name of liberty and against socialism. So, and the United States is a federation. You see the fantastic differences, partly also because there are rural communities, mm-hmm. but it's now the rural communities who are getting a serious contagion because they did not learn from the future. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But you meant in Europe the solidarity that is a bit damaged through the pandemic? Or?
I was wondering
that. Yes. I think the Netherlands are changing a bit their position. No, I've heard recently, but I think, of course, to only focus on the money, which is also the problem of Germany and probably of the Netherlands, is misleading the debate because it's about le patrimoine, the immaterial, also the immaterial legacy. You know, in a country like Italy, how can you build Europe without Italy? It's the treasure, art and culture treasure of Europe. So this is something which you cannot measure materially, but which in the Netherlands is probably underestimated. The identification factor of having countries like Italy and Greece in Europe, that's what I mean. Mm-hmm. Without them, I really don't know what kind of European story I can tell.
I agree, but you're perfectly right, yes.
I want to go to a last a question that's also concerned with this, because you mentioned the money, of course. And you write, Abram, also in the article you wrote before the catastrophe that appeared in the Groene Amsterdammer not too long ago, on the 10th of May.
Yes.
And you write that now you have the pandemic and then a recession, and this recession is, of course, going to influence the Netherlands. And you say that in this recession, and I think we already saw that when the Dutch said, well, we don't really want to help with these Eurobonds. And you say in this recession, there's always the dangerous situation of a broader movement, a broader nationalistic and right-wing movement. Yeah. So you wrote that a month ago. What are you more hopeful now, or are you more skeptical?
No, certainly not. There's still, if there will be a certain recession, that means that many people are without work, or they lose their life's accomplishment of their own small businesses, and that makes for tremendous resentment. And we live in times in which the inequality of the distribution of income and wealth is so incredible that something must give. This has to create enormous conflicts. And at present, I don't know why this should be so, but the energy is with the extreme right, and it is not with progressive forces. There is a feeling of discouragement, of passivity. People have lost their stamina, whereas on the right there is a worldwide movement of right-wing parties looking at each other and encouraging each other, and a very pathological phenomenon. We have a Prime Minister, Rutte, who is doing very well, who has fantastic support because he handled the crisis rather well. So he has an enormous political capital, but all the time these middle-of-the-road, right-of-center parties are so afraid for the right-wing vote that they already do and already realize what the extreme right would realize if it came to power. For example, cutting off Italy, allowing Greece to suffocate with all the refugees without helping them. And Rutte has enough political capital to say, we're going to have a more politics of solidarity. Like Merkel. Merkel uses her political capital to do what she thinks is the right thing. Mm-hmm. And that is why she is my hero.
Mine too.
Good. We have a hero. History warned us against that.
I'm happy for you guys. Do you want to react to that?
No, I actually totally agree. But I'm not that pessimistic because I see also other forces which, with the crisis, actually, as you said before, learn from the future. Well, they learn from the pandemic, but also from the future to reinvent themselves. To quote Macron, who said he will be the first to reinvent himself. I don't know how long it would last. This is. We will be able to say to make a direct conclusion in 1 year maybe, but I see this big potential right now, how a whole society can try to reinvent itself. So but at the same time, or as always, extremist parties are stronger. But I don't think they can be solider in Europe because it is the nature of an extremist party to be a nationalist. So this is their limit.
Let me correct myself in one way. You asked me, since the 4 weeks that have passed, or 5, 6 weeks, do I think different? Yes. In the meantime, Black Lives Matter has resurged as a global movement. And it's so energized and it's so incredibly emotional. It has such an electric charge. And suddenly you think, no, this cannot go on. And you realize what people of color have been going through, what they had to swallow. And there is this movement. So yes, that energizes me. That gives me a new hope.
I think I'm going to thank you both. I think I'm going to see if there's any questions in the audience. Are there any questions? I have this really long 1.5 meter.
Boom.
We should honor this microphone. A question, no?
Is it ook bar? Nobody a question?
Reaction.
A reaction.
Critic.
Give it a try. I got the impression that you were thinking that the populists are making up stories about the past. I have more the feeling that they are revitalizing the old stories. When I was a kid, Peter's son Koen was a hero. And when you take away these stories, I don't mind, but if you take it away, these stories, people feel uncomfortable. You know, you steal their story, and they are part of a community with a story. And the left people took away this story, and that makes them uncomfortable. So they are not too creative, those people. They don't make up new stories. They pick up the old stories. The stupid black man, you know that. So that's don't give them too much power, or don't think they are creative, or they have the energy of the hatred. And Black Matters is indignation. You know, they are really they are mad with anger, with this injustice. So it's a better energy.
Well, I wouldn't underestimate them too much, though. I think, okay, Putin is not maybe right extreme, but he's done very well in giving the Russian back a glorious memory. And it's working very well. And you don't need something complex to please the need of story. You need a simple identity. And this is what we don't have in Europe, because in Europe we are always looking for our identity. And it's difficult. You know, it's actually, this is what they offer. They offer an identity with a very clear past, which is not questioned, and it's glorious. So it is actually a very dangerous way of seducing people, and they are, as always, quite successful at it. And by the way, I think the Nazis were quite inventive in their way of inventing this new German man. Wasn't that, or the fascist, you know?
Good point.
Which was an art which is very present still now in Italy, which is quite impressive.
And my last remark here is that I was talking about the situation with the guy who knows the classical world very well, and he said to me, well, in society there are always 20-25% of the people are not able to catch up with the technological developments. What do you think about that idea?
Me? I'm part of this 25%.
I don't believe you. You being coy.
Are you part of the 25% too? No? No.
So they are Trump calls them deplorables, I think.
There was Clinton, Hillary.
Oh, yeah?
There was a turning point in her campaign. She called these, let me say, what we used to call poor white trash. People who voted, salary people, wage workers, peasants, who vote on the right against their own interests. And then she said that word deplorables, and she gave it all away. She gave it all away how us urban progressives sort of look down a little bit on these rural people, those rednecks, poor white trash. And suddenly I'm talking about us, our great urban progressive secret, that we look down upon some people, came out of her mouth. There was a turning point, I think. Deplorables is zielepoten.
Iemand? Ja, ik kom naar u toe.
Toch, u heeft een vraag,
hè? Is it allowed to ask you a question about Les Amnésiques? Is it? Thank you for that book. I think it's really a great work to read. I've got one question about it. why didn't you elaborate on England and the role of England? Because you've got quite a list of regions, quite a list of countries that you elaborate on. France and Germany, obviously, then followed by the Netherlands, then there is Eastern Europe, and then there is, if I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, Austria-Hungary. So that's your list, so to say. Why is there no elaborations on England as the primary force in Europe and on the English nationalists and imperialists of this time?
There is a chapter about Italy and Austria. Then there is France and Germany, and a bit of Eastern Europe. The reason why I chose these countries is because they have a fascist past. So Italy was fascist, Austria too, and 5 of the East European countries were also allied with the Third Reich. It's not the case of Great Britain. So this is why I chose these countries. Now, Netherlands is in the Dutch book because it's a book to be read by the Dutch. So with my editor, we thought it's interesting to have this approach for a Dutch public. And the reception wasn't that good of this chapter. So this is an exercise I didn't repeat after because I thought it is very difficult to get to judge the way a country is dealing with its history from outside. It can be very badly perceived. But for the English version, which will come out in September, American and English version, the Dutch chapter is not in there, of course, because I don't think many Americans know where Netherlands are. But there are some pages about the British Empire and of course the racial segregation in the United States. So there are 4 pages about Great Britain, how it dealt with or not dealt with this past, because of course it is surprising. It was surprising for me to discover that Great Britain hasn't done anything about this imperial past. And as many have observed in Great Britain, there is maybe a link between that total lack of work of memory and Brexit. Brexit, which has been supported by an elite who is educated in private schools where the imperial tradition is still worshipped, and who are most of the time coming from families who made their fortune in colonialism. So you cannot expect from this elite to question this past. And this way of not questioning the past probably preserved the illusion that Great Britain still has enough influence in the world to act without the help of the European Union. I think this illusion of the influence of Great Britain is still very strong among British. Now maybe it's it's falling again.
I think I'm gonna let us out of this really hot room in a minute. I wanted to ask you a bit of a hopeful question to end this evening with. If you have a hope in a way that we're going to remember this COVID-19 period, what would be your hope? How do you hope we'll remember it?
Abram?
Well, I'm becoming a sentimental old sociologist, and we sociologists must always try to think about how people are connected and dependent upon one another. And of course, pandemics, global pandemics, is a fantastic image of these interdependencies, of this invisible network of how people are connected and how they can contaminate one another, but also together sort of try to overcome the virus. So yes, it is in a way, it might awaken people to the interdependence of people. So we should be a little bit careful with each other.
Yes, because I think maybe, I mean, we were already interdependent, but we were not solidar. And I think maybe this is what we can learn from this crisis, is that an interdependency without human solidarity is dangerous, but interdependency based on solidarity is actually giving us hope for the future.
Thank you, Géraldine, Schwarz, Abram de Swaan, for being here, and thank you also for coming. It was hot.
Yes.
I hope you enjoyed it, and I think it's a good time to have a drink.
Thank you so much.
Both.
Thank you, Jente.